It was a cold fall night, the clock ticking closer to 9 o'clock in the evening. In a cozy house just inside the town limits, 14-year-old Alex was looking after his younger cousin Max. The evening seemed ordinary enough as Max's parents, Alex's aunt and uncle, had gone shopping and his own parents had gone to the movies. It was just Alex and Max enjoying a relaxed evening. As the night progressed, however, an eerie feeling began to envelop Alex. Something was wrong, a strange restlessness that he had no way of getting rid of. At first he brushed it off, attributing it to his overactive imagination. The two of them watched television, but the uneasy feeling did not leave them. Gradually the sensation grew stronger, and Alex's instincts began to kick in. As if on autopilot, Alex stood up and went to the back door, his heart pounding frantically. He locked the door, subconsciously wanting to protect Max from anything that caused this anxiety. Walking back through the kitchen, his eyes widened with shock when he saw a disheveled, homeless-looking man staring out the window. The man's gaze was fixed on Max, and Alex's protective instincts flared. Keeping his composure, Alex continued to act normal in front of Max. He decided to suggest they go upstairs, telling the story of their parents' imminent return and Max's need to go to bed early. Upstairs, he tucked Max into bed, assuring him that everything was fine. However, mentally he knew that there was a threatening person lurking outside. Alex, a high school soccer player, was about 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed about 125 pounds. He may not have been imposing physically, but his instincts and defensive nature fueled his determination. Descending the stairs, he headed straight for the kitchen and grabbed a meat tenderizer hammer, an improvised weapon. Turning to the window, he found the man had disappeared. A wave of panic came over him, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. Walking to the front door, he made sure it was securely locked. Both the deadbolt and the handle were engaged. With his heart racing, Alex rushed back upstairs with the meat softener in his hand. Entering Max's room, he closed the door behind him and stood between the door and Max's bed. Alex calmly told Max that there was a situation downstairs and told him to stay hidden and be quiet. With his heart in his throat, Alex called the police. He then called his father and uncle, who were at the movie theater, and informed them of the chilling ordeal unfolding at Max's house. It would take the police at least half an hour to arrive, while his father and uncle were a grueling 45-minute drive away. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a rumble, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots stomping across the first floor. Alex's pulse quickened, his grip on the meat softener clenched tighter. He stood his ground, determination hiding his fear, listening to the anxious movements of the intruder below. Time seemed to stretch, and every second seemed like an eternity. Alex's breathing was shallow, and his thoughts were consumed with imminent danger. His senses were on alert, every creak and shuffle echoing in the quiet night. Then the situation escalated. The heavy footsteps of an intruder echoed up the stairs, making Alex's heart nearly jump out of his chest. Being only a few feet away from Max's bedroom door, Alex gripped the meat grinder even tighter. He could hear the man checking the doorknobs first in his aunt and uncle's room, then in the bathroom. The fear intensified as the man went downstairs and finally ventured down into the basement. The minutes dragged on, each one straining Alex's nerves to the breaking point. The tension was palpable, the fear and anticipation reaching almost unbearable levels. Finally, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night and the police arrived. Bursting into the house, their presence brought relief amidst the darkness that enveloped the night. The intruder, it turned out, was a man who had escaped from a mental hospital in a neighboring province. The action takes place in an ordinary apartment building tucked away in a corner of the city. In this cozy apartment lives Sarah, a young woman with a malleable character and a heart always open to her family. She often finds herself drawn into the affairs of her loved ones. One fateful night, Sarah lay on the couch in the living room, lost in the embrace of sleep. The soft glow of the streetlights cast an ethereal hue on her room. The sound of a creaking door reached her ears. Sarah moved but didn't fully wake up, assuming it was her sister Emily. Emily had a penchant for dramatic appearances, often seeking refuge on Sarah's couch after an argument with her boyfriend. Sarah had two couches in the living room, so there was no problem with where her sister would position herself. convinced that her sister was responsible for the sounds. Sarah's consciousness drifted back into sleep. Meanwhile, Sarah could hear Emily pacing around the room with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. As the night thickened, Sarah could hear Emily busily preparing an impromptu midnight snack, and the clinking of dishes and sizzling of the frying pan became an unintentional lullaby for Sarah. The morning light began to filter through the windows, chasing away the night shadows. Sarah's eyes flew open, her mind still tangled in the threads of dreams. She turned her head toward the other couch, expecting to see Emily, but what appeared before her eyes sent shivers down her spine. The couch was vacant. Panic began to scratch at the edges of her consciousness. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone, fingers dancing across the screen to text Emily. "Did you come over last night?" The words hung in the air as she waited for an answer. Minutes turned into moments of agonizing silence, and finally there was a reply. "No, I didn't come over. Are you okay?" A heavy weight rested on Sarah's chest. The creaking door, the sounds that had been brushed off as mundane, took on a bad connotation. It wasn't her sister who had invaded her apartment, but someone unknown to her. With trembling hands, Sarah looked around her surroundings, her eyes stopping at the door leading to the outside world. It was then that she noticed the faint glimmer of sunlight on the doorknob, a clear sign that it had been forced open. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized that an intruder had used this rarely used door to gain access. A flood of emotions overwhelmed her: fear, anger, and an overwhelming sense of dread. She examined her belongings, her heart thudding in her ears. But strangely, nothing was wrong. Her electronics lay untouched, her valuables untouched. What did this man want? She realized that someone had been with her that night, but who it was and why he had entered the house was still unknown. In a quiet town in the heart of the countryside, there lived a man named Ethan. He was well known as a friendly man, a neighbor who always had a warm smile and an outstretched helping hand. Every morning he sat on his back porch, savoring a cup of coffee and enjoying the serene beauty of the trees surrounding his property. One sunny morning, as birds sang and a light breeze rustled the leaves, Ethan's peaceful routine was disrupted by a sight that sent shivers down his spine. From behind a thick line of trees at the edge of his property, a man appeared, unkempt and wild-looking. His eyes were blank and his movements were frantic as he tore menacingly toward Ethan's house. The hair on the back of Ethan's neck stood up. He lived alone and often used his backyard as a shooting range, which explained the collection of firearms he kept in his house. As the wild-eyed man rushed toward the house, Ethan was overcome with a sense of danger. He instinctively locked all the doors and dialed the emergency number to call the police. What Ethan didn't realize was that this wasn't the man's first encounter with his home. The intruder had snuck in through the basement window the day before and spent the night squatting there, in eerie silence. He had left the basement door unlocked, giving him easy access to the rest of the house. Now, as Ethan desperately cried for help, the intruder was already climbing the stairs. Driven by an inexplicable madness, Ethan's heart beat faster as he heard heavy footsteps echoing up the stairs. He knew he had to defend himself. With trembling hands, he grabbed one of his rifles and aimed it at the approaching figure. The man's footsteps grew louder, his presence more ominous. Ethan's finger pressed the trigger and he fired the first shot, a charge of rock salt. But to his horror, the man seemed unfazed, as if possessed by an unnatural determination. Without wasting a second, Ethan switched to the rubber bullet and fired again, this time aiming for the chest of the intruder. The impact should have incapacitated someone, but the man continued his relentless onslaught. Panic gripped Ethan as he reached for another shot. This time he chose something more lethal, a shotgun bullet or buckshot, he couldn't exactly remember. In the heat of the moment, the third shot echoed down the hallway, leaving a gaping hole in the uninvited guest's chest. The pain of the gunshot wound finally caught up with the intruder. His movements became weaker. His breathing labored. After a few moments, he collapsed lifelessly on top of Ethan. The weight of the man's body pressed down on Ethan, who was stunned and shaken beneath the lifeless body. Meanwhile, on the other end of the line, the emergency operator listened intently to the heartbreaking dialogue between Ethan and the intruder. Words of warning, desperate pleas, and gunshots lingered in their minds. They immediately called the police, knowing something serious was going on. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the air and law enforcement officers swarmed Ethan's property. The scene was surreal, a lifeless intruder sitting on a man who was fighting for his own survival. Authorities launched a thorough investigation into the incident. Realizing the complexity of the situation Ethan faced, as details emerged, it was revealed that the intruder had escaped from a psychiatric hospital in Baltimore. A few days earlier, he had managed to walk more than 50 miles to the quiet town, driven by some inexplicable force. The local newspapers were abuzz with the shocking story, drawing attention to the eerie events that had unfolded in the midst of their peaceful community. Ethan found himself at the center of a criminal investigation, his actions dissected and analyzed. The fear he felt, the shots he fired, and the fight for his life were scrutinized by those seeking to understand the truth. But as the evidence came together, it became obvious that Ethan had acted in self-defense, a normal man forced to confront an unthinkable threat. In the sprawling landscape of the American Center on the outskirts of Pocatello, Idaho, was a quiet gas station that had become a haven for truckers traveling the desert highways. Among them was Jake Reynolds, an experienced truck driver with a weathered face and calloused hands. To him, the truck was more than just a vehicle, it was his home on wheels, a familiar companion on endless roads. The cab of the truck held more memories than any other home, and the bed hidden behind the driver's seat gave him solace in the midst of his nomadic life. One moonlit night, with the hum of street traffic in the distance, Jake found himself parked at a familiar gas station. He watched the stars dot the inky sky overhead, his eyelids heavy as he succumbed to the embrace of sleep. The rhythmic sigh of the wind and the distant hum of passing cars became a lullaby. Morning came, and Jake awoke from his sleep. The soft light of dawn shone through the windows of the truck, revealing a world of pale hues. As his eyes adjusted, a sudden realization struck him like lightning. The doors to his truck were ajar. Panic slammed into his veins, replacing insomnia with a sudden rush of adrenaline. With his heart racing, Jake looked around the cabin. His wallet, once neatly placed on the passenger seat, was now scattered like leaves in the wind. Credit cards, driver's licenses, and IDs were scattered all over the seat, but nothing was missing except a crisp $20 bill. A rush of indignation and vulnerability came over him, but he quickly pushed it aside, convincing himself that it was only a small loss, hardly worth involving the police. Jake's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of a figure moving away from the gas station. The man, shrouded in the morning mist, gave off an aura of roughness and uncertainty. It was as if a sinister shadow had materialized out of the night, a vagrant lurking on the periphery of his existence. Two ends fell into place like pieces of a puzzle. The sneaky vagrant must have been the one who had disturbed his sanctuary. Fear and anxiety simmered in him at the thought of someone who had been so close to him while he slept. The engine roared as Jake pulled onto the highway, the asphalt stretching like a promise of escape. But no matter how many miles he put between himself and the gas station, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something far more serious might have happened that night. One evening, parked at a truck stop in another state, Jake was talking to another driver. The stories flowed like diesel fuel, tales of highways, country roads, and oddities encountered along the way. Amidst the camaraderie, Jake recalled his own experience, and he recounted a gruesome accident at a gas station near Pocatello. To his surprise, the elderly driver shared a tip that sent shivers down Jake's spine: the advice to pull the seatbelt through the door handles before going to bed. It was a simple trick that could prevent this offense from happening again. In a charming suburban town lived a 12-year-old girl named Louise. Louise was a resourceful and adventurous young soul who loved to spend her days exploring the woods behind her house and making up fantastic stories. However, in the midst of this idyll there was one circumstance that disrupted her peaceful existence. A persistent and annoying 19-year-old guy named Max. Max lived only a few houses away from Louise, and he liked her very much. Despite Louise's repeated attempts to kindly decline his advances, Max remained unwavering. often showing up uninvited during her outdoor adventures or trying to strike up a conversation. At the most inopportune moment, Louise was growing increasingly annoyed with Max's relentless pursuit, and she wished he would finally take the hint. One pleasant afternoon, Louise's parents informed her that they had business to attend to in a neighboring town and would be gone for a few hours. Promising a quiet house just for herself, she impatiently waved goodbye as her parents left. Louise decided to take the opportunity to catch up on some much-needed sleep and headed to her room, curling up under her cozy blanket. However, the tranquility was abruptly broken by the shrill ringing of the phone, which woke her up, confused and sleepy. Louise stumbled out of bed and made her way to the ringing phone on the kitchen wall. She picked up the receiver and heard a barrage of vulgar and disturbing words that made her blood run cold. It was a prank, a cruel and twisted joke, and Emily's heart pounded frantically as she tried to make sense of the horrible words thrown at her. With a trembling hand, Emily hung up the phone, a mixture of anger and fear simmering in her head. It was the mid-80s and there was no caller ID to trace the call or block unwanted numbers. As she stood there trying to regain her composure, goosebumps ran down her back. She went back to her room and then it happened, a sharp knock on the window pane. Louise's heart jumped to her throat and she turned toward the source of the sound. Her eyes widened in disbelief and horror when she saw Max's smirking face pressed against the glass. How did he know she was alone? Why was he knocking on her window? The seconds ticked by like clockwork as Louise and Max stared at each other, frozen in a tense and confusing confrontation. Just as panic threatened to consume her, the front door swung open, and the sounds of her parents' voices echoed through the house. Relief swept over Louise like a tidal wave, and her legs gave out as she rushed downstairs to greet her parents. She could barely get the words out as she recounted the disturbing events that had just transpired.